Welcome back, my financially curious friends, to Boss Economics World, the only show that turns the dismal science into a full-blown circus of economic absurdity. I'm your host, the Sultan of Supply and Demand, the Maestro of Market Mayhem, and today, oh boy, do we have a doozy of a story to unpack. We're diving headfirst into the economic quagmire of the good old US of A, where consumer spending is tanking, companies are playing tariff roulette, and GDP growth is slower than a snail on a coffee break. So, grab your wallets, hide your savings, and let's break down this hot mess of economic chaos, Boss Economics style. Alright, folks, let's set the stage. Picture this, it's 2025, and the US economy is chugging along like a rusty old pickup truck on a dirt road. According to the latest data from Uncle Sam's number crunchers, inflation-adjusted GDP, the big kahuna of economic metrics, grew at an annualized rate of 3% in Q2 2025. Sounds decent, right? But hold your applause, because when you zoom out, the first half of 2025 averaged a measly 1.25% growth. That's a full percentage point below 2024's pace. Oof, talk about a buzzkill. And if you think that's bad, dig into the real juicy metric economists are obsessing over: final sales to private domestic purchasers. This bad boy, which strips out all the trade and inventory noise, grew at a pathetic 1.2% in Q2, the slowest since late 2022. Yawn. So, what's behind this economic snooze fest? Oh, let me count the ways. We've got consumers tightening their belts, companies running scared from trade policy whiplash, and a Federal Reserve that's probably sweating bullets trying to figure out what to do next. But don't worry, folks, your OL pal at Boss Economics World is here to break it all down, from the surface-level shenanigans to the deep, dark economic underbelly. Buckle up, because this ride's about to get bumpy. First up, let's talk about the real MVPs of the US economy: you, me, and every Joe and Jane Schmo out there spending their hard-earned cash. Or, should I say, not spending it. Consumer spending, which accounts for a whopping 70% of US GDP, yep, you heard that right, 70%, is slowing down faster than a sloth on a Monday morning. Why? Well, let's start with inflation. Even though inflation has cooled from its 2022 peak of 9.1%, the latest data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows the Consumer Price Index still ticking up at 3.2% year-over-year in mid-2025. Sure, it's not the double-digit nightmare of a few years ago, but when your grocery bill, rent, and gas prices are still climbing, it feels like a punch to the wallet. And here's the kicker, folks: real wages, what you actually take home after inflation, have barely budged. According to the Economic Policy Institute, real average hourly earnings grew by a measly 0.8% in the past year. So, while Wall Street fat cats are popping champagne, Main Street is stuck eating ramen noodles. No wonder consumers are saying, "Nah, I'm good," and cutting back on everything from lattes to new cars. Retail sales data from the U.S. Census Bureau backs this up. Retail spending growth slowed to just 1.5% in Q2 2025, down from 3.8% in 2024. Ouch. But wait, there's more. It's not just inflation, it's the vibe, baby. Consumer confidence is in the toilet, and I don't mean the fancy bidet kind. The Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index dropped to 95.3 in July 2025, its lowest level since early 2023. Why? Because people are scared. Scared of losing their jobs, scared of rising prices, and scared of, drumroll, please, trade policy chaos. Which brings us to our next point. Yes, the Trump administration's trade policy, aka the economic equivalent of a clown car on fire. Remember when tariffs were supposed to make America great again? Well, folks, it looks like they're making America's companies greatly annoyed instead. The latest GDP data shows that swings in trade and inventories are distorting the numbers so much, economists are basically throwing up their hands and saying, forget GDP, let's look at final sales instead. And why are trade and inventories so wonky? Because companies are stockpiling goods like it's the apocalypse, trying to dodge the next round of tariffs, sanctions, or whatever trade policy curveball gets lobbed their way. Just look at the headlines, folks. In June 2025, the Trump administration floated the idea of slapping 25% tariffs on European Union goods, citing unfair trade practices. And don't forget the ongoing saga with China. Tariffs on Chinese imports are still hovering at 20%, with threats of escalation if Beijing doesn't play ball. According to a 2025 report from the National Bureau of Economic Research, these trade policies have already cost U.S. companies $1.7 trillion in lost market value since 2018, and the uncertainty is killing investment. Business fixed investment, the stuff that actually creates jobs, grew by a pathetic 0.9% in Q2 2025, down from 4.2% in 2024. Coincidence? I think not. And here's the irony, folks, these tariffs were supposed to protect American jobs, but they're doing the opposite. Just look at the manufacturing sector. The Institute for Supply Management's manufacturing PMI dropped to 47.8 in July 2025, signaling contraction for the third straight month. Why? Because tariffs are driving up costs for raw materials, squeezing margins, and making U.S. goods less competitive. Oh, and let's not forget the farmers. Soybean exports to China are still down 30% from pre-trade war levels, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So much for winning. Now, let's talk about everyone's favorite central bank, the Federal Reserve. Oh, the Fed, what a pickle they're in. With GDP growth slowing, consumer spending tanking, and companies running scared, economists like Scott Anderson from BMO Capital Markets are saying, hey, Fed, it's time to cut rates. And honestly, folks, they might be right. The Fed's benchmark interest rate is currently sitting at 4.75% in mid-2025, down from a peak of 5.5% in 2023, but still high enough to make borrowing expensive. And when borrowing is expensive, guess what? Businesses don't invest, consumers don't spend, and the economy goes, bleh. But here's the catch, folks, cutting rates isn't a magic bullet. Remember, inflation is still at 3.2%, above the Fed's 2% target. If they cut rates too soon, they risk reigniting inflation, and then we're back to 2022's nightmare of $5 eggs and $100 gas fill-ups. But if they wait too long, they risk tipping the economy into a recession. Just look at the yield curve. The spread between 10-year and 2-year Treasury yields inverted again in June 2025, a classic recession warning sign. And according to a Bloomberg survey, 65% of economists now predict a recession by mid-2026 if the Fed doesn't act soon. Talk about a rock in a hard place. So, let's zoom out, folks, and look at the big picture. What we've got here is a perfect storm of economic absurdity. Consumers are tapped out, companies are paralyzed by trade policy chaos, and the Fed is stuck playing a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole. And here's the kicker, this isn't just a US problem. The International Monetary Fund just downgraded its 2025 global growth forecast to 3.1%, citing, you guessed it, trade tensions and policy uncertainty. So, while the US economy is hitting the brakes, the rest of the world is saying, hey, wait for us. But fear not, my financially savvy friends, because here at Boss Economics World, we don't just point out the problems, we predict the future. Will the Fed cut rates and save the day? Will tariffs finally make America great again, or just make everything more expensive? Will consumers ever open their wallets again, or are we doomed to a world of ramen noodles and Netflix? Stay tuned, because we'll be here, breaking it all down with a healthy dose of satire, sarcasm, and economic swagger. That's all for today, folks. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell, because in this economy, every notification counts. Until next time, keep your wallets tight and your economic skepticism tighter. This is Boss Economics World, signing off.